our newest integration kinds are data flow and control flow. So these are designer-based integration kinds. So like in enterprise solutions, like in Boomi, Talent, etc. Data flow integration went out of beta status, so it was released today. So let's show how it is configured. So in data integration, you configure flow of data on a diagram. First, on a diagram you add components, you configure links between them. This determines how records are loaded. First, we need to add source component. It queries record from the data source. In source component, you can select any of your connections that you created on Scivia, or create a new one if necessary. After this, you select what action to perform in source component to query the data. So let me probably select Salesforce. It is more appropriate for demonstration. For Salesforce, we have more actions, so we can execute SQL command here. We can build query visually, like we did in query. And we also can run a native Salesforce report. So if you have any reports in your Salesforce, we can just select a report here and load data from this report. So let's just query all data from contact object, for example. We can also preview the set of columns that are queried. After this, we can add transformation components to the data flow to perform various transformations. So split component just splits the flow of records into multiple flows, so you can load data from one source into multiple targets, etc. Conditional split splits flow depending on some conditions on record fields. So here we can, as a split, sorry, I meant to add conditional split here. Here you can create conditional outputs and specify conditions for them. So using our expression editor, using the same functions, operators, etc., that are used in our expression mapping, and this condition may access properties that are available in the input of this component and variables of the package. Here you can create multiple conditional outputs to which records will be redirected depending if they match certain condition. Then we have other components, so row count components to count the number of records that passed through this component and store the result in a variable. And lookup component to query data from another data source based on input. So here, for example, we can select another connection. Like BigCommerce, we can select an action to query data, either an SQL command here or lookup action, where you can select. So simply select the corresponding table to search matching record, and here you can set up which columns to use for matching, and which columns to query from the lookup data source. And after this, you can configure mapping of the corresponding parameters corresponding to the key columns to source. Here in the mapping, you can just select an input column or specify a complex expression to calculate the result to match to this lookup column, etc. So depending on the lookup behavior, we either fill records with no matches with nulls and direct them to main output, or direct them to error output. And we can add more transformations. So extend component adds calculated columns to the result, to the set of columns, so to the scope. Value component selects a value of some of the columns, which you can select which kind of value to select, and it stores it in a variable. Data flow has a set of parameters that you can create and variables. The difference is that parameter values are stored between data flow runs, so you can run data flow, store some value in a parameter, and it will be available during the next run of the data flow. Variables are available only within the data flow run, so you can so you can fill this variable with a value using either value component or row count component and use it within this run further. To configure data flow, you also need to configure its result settings. You need to calculate the number of success records and error records. And by the way, in the end of data flow, usually we load records to some target where we select again a connection to load data to. We select an action to apply, either insert, update, delete records, or execute custom SQL command for databases. And here we can write the command. So let's select a table. We have the target table columns the parameters for the insert action, and here we configure mapping for them. We specify which input columns to load into this column, etc. So we need to specify mapping for all the columns. If columns have the same names in source and target, we can use auto mapping, and as we can see, it found columns with the same name and mapped them automatically. Here we also can either use just a source column, or specify a constant, or specify an expression here. So that's all about. And let's proceed to the result settings. The result settings determine what values will be displayed as the number of success records and error records. Since data flow can be complex, it can have multiple targets, and data from one target can be loaded further, so to another target, etc. So you, for example, you can query some values from some auto-generated values from one target and load it further to another target. You can load records from error outputs to some different target or to log, and this makes a calculation of success and error rows a complex process. So we let user determine what records consider as success records and what records consider as error records. So usually user just adds row count components to the necessary place of the data flow. For example, row count for success and error records. And then as row counts store data, store the number of records in the specified variables. So let's create success and errors variables. And then simply, so in a simple case, we just write the name of these variables here. And the result of this data flow will display the number of the corresponding numbers. In case of multiple targets, you can sum these variables, or perform other mathematical operations here. So like this. And let's show another feature. In data flows, you can also create log connections. So these connections will load data to CSV files with the specified columns. So you can create schema of log and, if necessary, load data to it. And this log will be available after data flow was executed. So let's show an example data flow here. So one of our users had such use case when he needed to load data from the database to Zoho CRM, and if a record existed in Zoho CRM, the user needed to update only certain fields, and if records didn't exist, user needed to load data to insert a record with more fields mapped. If the same fields need to be mapped, this task can be solved, for example, with our import tool with its absurd operation. But in case if different fields needs to be mapped for different operations, it probably will be better to load data with data flow. So what this data flow does, first it loads data from the SQL Server, and it loads only new records. So it has parameter max created date, which stores the max created date of the records loaded in the previous run. So we count the number of rows loaded. We query. We check if the record exists via lookup. We query the record ID from Zoho CRM if such record exists. If a record exists, we will obtain the ID, and if record doesn't exist in Zoho in target, then the ID is filled with the ID column is filled with null. Then we store the max created date, max date of records of record in source with a value component to our variable having the same name as parameter, and then we split records based on whether the ID is null. If ID is null, the record is sent to insert output, and if if the record ID queried from Zoho is not null, the record is sent to the default output. And depending on this output, we perform either insert operation via target component or update operation. And we count the success records finally. If we insert data to Zoho, we also query the result ID from Zoho, and we update this record back in our source Azure database, and we assign it the corresponding ID from Salesforce. Error records, so if a record failed to insert or failed to update, are written to logs. We have a name, so to determine what records we write, and error message. So they are written to log. Next time package, so data flow will remember the max created date of records loaded the previous time, and in source we check we query only records more than this stored time of last record update in the previous time. So in this case, so this is how we query only new records each data flow run. So I think that's all about our data flow. So we can see how the results of data flow looks. So here you can see how many records were loaded successfully, how many records failed, and you can download logs or view them in the browser. And log tab allows you to view runs for the specified period. So monitor tab shows you last 5 runs of the package, and log tab shows you runs for the specified period. I think this is all about data flow. I also may show you how I configured the result settings. This row counts components counts records successfully loaded into Zoho and stores them in the variables. And for error records, we simply subtract these values from the number of total rows counted by this row count component. Let's proceed to control flow. Control flow allows you to implement logics in your integration. It allows running multiple data flows, and it allows you to run these data flows one after another. It allows you to perform some checks, to check some conditions which were based on variables modified by a data flow. For example, if too many records failed, we can check number of failed records in a condition in an if component and perform some actions. So like fail the control flow if too many records more than error threshold were failed, etc. So as for the components, it has the following components. Core components determine determine control flow execution. you can use if component for creating conditional logics. You can use parallel component to run multiple control flows in parallel. Exception fails the control flow completely. Stops control flow whenever it's reached. Try catch allows you to perform error processing. So if an exception occurred inside try catch component, then the catch branch is executed. And action components directly interact with data sources or modify variables. So action component can run various action against data sources. So you select a connection and you select an action to perform either. So for example, you can insert records into database, you can execute custom SQL command in action, you can perform test connection, so whether the connection is whether the connection is correctly configured, and you can connect to this data source. And you can set variables via set variables component. And data flow component performs data flow, which you open it and configure data flow as I showed you in about the data flow product. So kind of packages. So how control flow can be used? So it can be used to perform certain data flows in specific orders. It can be used to perform certain actions before and after data flow. For example, you can create tables in target database before loading data into them, or you can check if such tables exist via SQL command. Place the result of this check into variable and then perform some actions depending on this variable. Etc. You can implement error logic. So if your data flow fails, what to do? So I think that's all variants. So that's what I wanted to show about data flow.